How's that?
That's perfect. All right, just go ahead
Okay.
and share your screen.
Let's see. I don't see that here on the Zoom. Okay. Where's the share button?
It's that green button with the up arrow.
I don't have it. Hmm. Hmm. What am I looking at here? I just have something that says Zoom on it, and I don't see anything else.
Um, should be there. Shared it before.
Hmm. I don't know. Not a good start.
No worries.
Let's try this again.
Okay.
Okay, now I see you.
Mm-hmm.
Where the hell is this share?
Are you still in the full screen for your presentation?
Well, I not right now. No. I
Okay. There might
think.
be another window for Zoom that you're not seeing.
Okay. Oh, okay. Here we go.
Perfect.
Okay. Back to full screen. Sorry about that. Okay.
I don't see your screen yet.
The chair. Share.
There we go.
Okay.
All right,
Very good.
perfect.
Very good.
All right, so just make that full screen. Perfect. All right. Um, Thank you everybody for tuning in. Really appreciate you coming out to see this presentation that our longtime member, presenter, Dan McFadden has put together for us. Dan actually put together did this presentation for us several years ago, back when we were at the Morris Museum before COVID, but we didn't have the forethought to broadcast it or record it. So Dan, we really appreciate you coming back out to do another presentation for us, and looking forward to seeing this one again. So thank you.
Well, it's not the same show as before. I can never leave well enough alone, and I sort of started from scratch. So, but it's the
Perfect.
same material. Uh,
Perfect.
so
Yeah.
this is a concerned a trip that took place in 1979. It was a private car trip across Canada, and it was by to do with Tri-State that I was able to get the contact to ride this trip. Earlier in the year, Tri-State ran a trip to Vermont with this equipment, and I met George Pins, who owned the car. And I told George that I would love to ride. And he says, "Well, he says, this is the last trip, and right now it's sold out." I said, "Okay, if somebody drops out, give me a call." And 2 weeks before the trip, that's what happened. And I just dropped everything and rode. It was the last chance, and I was very happy I did. It still ranks large in my rail fan experiences, the trip across Canada. Anyway, most of the time when you think of an important, a famous piece of equipment, you're thinking about an engine. You're thinking about an engine that has uh, the first of its kind, whatever. In this case, we're talking about a rail car. And this car was the Pennsy 120. It was built for the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1928. So at current day, it's almost 100 years old. It's getting up for 100 years old. And so we all know that things didn't go well for the Pennsylvania Railroad. They merged with the with the New York Central, and there was there was one of the worst bankruptcy in history to that point. And a lot of things went up for sale, including the 120. And luckily, George Pins bought this car. Before that time, this car had already been a famous car. It was on the RFK funeral train when Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. the railroad ran a special train carrying his remains from New York down to Arlington Cemetery. And if you look on YouTube and look up RFK funeral train, you'll see loads of coverage. Millions of people came out. Well, millions, but supposedly, a million or so people came out to watch that train pass by. The main line there was so many people out that they had to run the train slowly for fear things would happen. And but it was an all-day event, televised, and you can see it all on YouTube. Quite an interesting, just a lot of interesting material. So anyway, the trip ran out of Penn Station, New York, and it ran on the Montrealer. George Pins found the Canadian National to be very cooperative, uh, easy to work with, and he viewed the Montrealer as his escape train because Amtrak was anything but easy to work with. Um, and he ran a number of trips across Canada. This was the last of those. So this is the first shot of the day. We're sitting in Montreal, and George distributed an itinerary. I was assigned to room. I'm not too sure if I had bedroom B or room 86, but I was assigned to the car I called the Shenandoah. Besides the Pennsy 120, George owned two sleepers. He owned the Shenandoah, which was an ex-C&O car, and he owned the Virginia Beach, which was ex-ACL. And he gave us an itinerary. Um, the, and the thing, basically, this trip, for the most part, we ran attached to via trains. So we went out on train number one on the CP. But when we got to Edmonton, we took a jog over the Northern Alberta, and that was really the exotic part of the trip, taking us to some very, very remote locations. So for all except those 3 days, we were part of a regular via train, via rail. But for 3 days, we ran as a passenger extra over the Northern Alberta and a new line called the Alberta Resources. And we'll get into that. So starting off, we had a free day in Montreal. And of course, if you're a rail fan in Montreal and you haven't been there a while, you go out and take a few shots of the trains. So this is a typical Via train at the time. Via was kind of new, and some equipment had been painted in the new scheme, but most of it had not. So most of these trains were a mixed bag of colors. And the commuter service was, sort of falling apart a little bit in Canada, just like it was falling apart here. You can see the Doral station kind of ramshackle. So after a free day in Montreal, we started off, and there was only one glitch in the trip, and it happened on the very, very first day. So all of a sudden, we noticed that we're crawling down. I never did find out exactly what the glitch was, but we're certainly not on the main line here. If you look at the track that the engine is on, you see a lot of grass. It was anything but a mainline experience to start. So after sitting there for an hour or two, the rail fans started to get a little restless, and we actually got off the train. So in a sense, it was good because we get out and take a few pictures. Normally on a through-line train, you're not getting out to take pictures. So if somebody can tell me where this is, I asked this crewman here, this maintenance of way guy, where am I? And he said Carlton Place. At least that's my memory. I've looked all over for Carlton Place. Maybe it's the name of a local neighborhood, but I've never been able to find out exactly where we were. But we eventually got going, and here we are. Here's the eastbound version of the Canadian coming by. And the CP, we went out on the CP for quite a distance, I guess, to Edmonton. And the CP is amazingly scenic along the shore of Lake Superior. If you look behind the train, you see those poles. That's a slide fence. So if something were to come down that mountain, the signals would be triggered red. Um, Along the shore of Lake Superior. And you can see that for this portion of the trip, the three special cars are on the front of the train. That's because they didn't want to be, I think that's because they didn't want to put them behind the CP observation. But later in the trip, our cars were always on the tail. If you look off to the left out in the distance, you can see Lake Superior. And it's a wilderness. So here's a woman who was riding the trip, sitting on a step stool to get people up, and just looking at Lake Superior. And we were free to walk through the train. We didn't have to stay. We didn't have to stay in the private cars. So sometimes you would go back there and get a snack. But early on, I walked through the whole train and got down to the observation car that the Canadian was famous for. And one of the first big stops was Thunder Bay. Uh, these trips do not move quickly. They're if you don't enjoy riding trains, once you get used to airplane travel, these things seem very, very slow. But of course, if you love riding trains, that's something of what you want. So here we are in Thunder Bay. If you look down to the right, you see a man there looking. They're doing an inspection, whatever he's looking at. Here's a broadside of the Pennsylvania 120 from the inside the station. And this is Mr. Sterling Toy. He was a sleeping car porter. George Pins brought several people out of retirement to work these trips, and Mr. Sterling Toy was one of them. Another shot at Thunder Bay. This is the chef on the 120. His name was Robbie Williams. And this is the most interesting person you might imagine. This is Rogers E.M. Whitaker, just a very interesting man. He was for his employment, he was an editor at the New Yorker, the magazine, and he would occasionally write articles about his train travels. He was also a theater critic. He would also write about football, particularly Ivy League football. Back in the day, the NFL wasn't such a big deal, but Ivy League football was, and he wrote about that. He wrote about a lot of things. And he had an obsession, and his obsession was accumulating mileage. And he kept detailed notes. He knew his mileage. With his detailed notes. He was able to tell you how many miles by train he had traveled in his lifetime, and it's a rather astonishing number. So if you were to travel 1,000 miles a week for 50 years, you still wouldn't come up to Roger Whittaker's total. And he picked up a nickname. The people at the New Yorker magazine called him Frimbo. I'm not too sure what the significance of that name was, but he was known as Frimbo. And in his writings, he would actually do it in the third person and talk about Frimbo. Frimbo told me something, this and that. And there was a book called All Aboard with E.M. Frimbo. And the book is largely a collection of his essays from the New Yorker magazine. He had a great sense of humor. It's an interesting book if you see it to pick it up. Okay, we've gone through the first day and it's evening. We're still in the eastern part of the country. I'm in the Dutch store of the Shenandoah there. And behind me is the Virginia Beach and the 120. So many times the next morning you look out and we're who knows where we are. It looks like a crew change point. Most of the time on these trips, you unless you're in a major city, you don't know where you are. And this is a typical instance. So I'm pretty sure this is a crew change. And this is a Melville. Now we're in Saskatchewan, Melville. And now at some point in this trip, the private cars have been moved to the rear of the train. So now we can sit in the rear platform and watch the world go by. And now we're in Saskatoon. One more shop in Saskatoon. You can see that these stops are not just 5-minute stops. People can get off, stretch their legs, look around, and enjoy some fresh air. Now we're on the road again on the main line. Okay, now we're in Edmonton at this point, and I'm looking at an old map of the Alberta Northern. So down here, we see Edmonton. We've come in on the CN line. We're in Edmonton. We're about to go up north, this line right here. I hope you can see my cursor. We're going to go up through to Smith, swing around, go by this big lake called Lesser Slave Lake, go through McLennan, and stop overnight at Peace River, where we'll just be the cars will be parked, and we'll be living right on the cars. The next day, day two of the 3-day side journey, we're going to go back down to McLennan, over here to Rycroft, and then down to this town called Grand Prairie. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we have lines that have been there for decades and decades, but there's a new line to be built that went south from Grand Prairie called the Alberta Resources, or at least that's what it was called initially. We'll see more about that in a minute. So now we're on the Alberta Northern. We have the Via Diesel. We have a caboose because we have an Alberta Northern crew, and then we have a conductor who's hanging out in the caboose. And we're going to take a leisurely trip over the Alberta Northern. And it's easy to tell where you are. You just look at the grain elevators. We're in Westlock. Now we come to the small town of Smith, Alberta. George Pins is standing at the rear of the diesel. You never see a camera. George Pins is never carrying a camera. He's always observing what's going on. If people are getting off, he's watching that they're going to get back on and not be left out in the wilderness. He was on the ball in every respect. When he was, he invited 30 people along. He had to be on the ball. So some local folks came out in Smith. This is probably a pretty unusual thing in Smith, Alberta. A picture from the other side. And off we go. The next stop was Slave Lake. When I saw only recently, I found out what the name Slave Lake is all about. It was I was wondering for a long time, does Slave Lake have anything to do with slavery? And the short answer is no. But the indigenous people there, the local people, the tribe, when you translated the name of that tribe, it came out to be something like Slavey. So Slavey, I guess, was too awkward, and the new settlers named the place Slave Lake. Another shot of Slave Lake. You can see George Pin standing by the rear of the car. He's got the step stool there to help everybody back on. And here is Slave Lake itself. We made another stop. We made multiple stops. You're going to see them all. So the real name of this is Lesser Slave Lake, and that was also the name of the town is Slave Lake. The name of the lake is Lesser Slave Lake. It turns out that in the Northern Territories, there's a Great Slave Lake, and the Great Slave Lake is really great. It's 20 times the size of this lake. So I guess to distinguish the two of them, this is called Lesser Slave Lake. There's George Pins. And here's a shot of the train right alongside the lake. And you can see people rounding up the people, and we're getting back on after that photo stop. And you see it's a good mix of people, a nice crowd, all ages, all sexes, kids, older people. Looking through the aisle of the car. Generally, you would see people sitting there and taking it all in, or on the back platforms. And now we've come to McLennan. McLennan was sort of the central point on the northern Alberta. That's where the shops were. Um, so the Northern Alberta was jointly owned by both the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific at this time. The other thing I'll point out is shortly before this trip, they had named all the diesels. So these four units of this type were named for rivers. All the other units were named for the various towns they passed through. They had a lot of mileage, but I don't think they had too much traffic. Another shot at McLennan. And here's a shot of Mr. Sterling Toy again. He always had his pipe. And finally, at the end of the day, we made it to Peace River. I'm sure that George took his equipment to many remote places, but I can't imagine too many places were more remote than this. And here's a picture of the Pennsy 120 there. And you see the ramshackle station. Broadside of the car. Late evening sun. Rimbaud was riding the Virginia Beach, and he was a prickly kind of guy. He called it the Virginia Bitch. I think the air conditioning wasn't working one particular day. Okay, now we've started out of Peace River, and we're going to head for Grand Prairie. There's a work crew out. It looks to me like they're replacing rail here. And in the caboose, the conductor hung out there. And here's a stop. I think this was the Smoky River. And basically the crews picked out these spots because I don't think George Pins had been this way, and they were very friendly. They let us do what we want, made a lot of stops. It was very leisurely. And for people who were doing if they wanted to do a video or a movie, they would always roll the train out on the bridge and roll it back. They could not have been more accommodating. I'm not too sure where I took that, a picture of a brake shoe. And the next stop was one of my favorites. I'm not too sure why it's one of my favorites, but Rycroft. The sun was just right, and all these little towns had their big grain elevators. I hear now that most of these elevators have disappeared, or many of them have. And now we're on the way again. This is the one picture that makes me very happy. I don't know what it is about this picture, but wide open spaces, beautiful sunshine. You can almost feel yourself on the rear platform rolling along in sort of a rhythmic way. And this picture as well. We did not uh, we did not see many local people on this trip. The people we saw were the people running the train, but is with wide open spaces there. And now we're coming into Grand Prairie, where we're going to make another stop for the night. And they had a very elegant dinner setting there. We didn't we with 30 people on they had two sittings, and basically you got to eat a nice meal every other night, something along those lines. And there were provisions made for other dinners for people, for people who were not eating in the 120. And the meals were very good in my memory. So this is kind of a desolate spot. We stayed overnight in Grand Prairie. Okay, it occurred to me I wanted to see what was left of the Northern Alberta. Could this trip have been run today? Uh, so down below to the lower right, we see Edmonton, and we went straight up to Smith and over to Peace River. There's a missing piece here. This piece of the Alberta of the Northern Alberta is gone. Uh, I did a little research, and it's a not totally clear in my mind, but apparently there were heavy floods, a lot of bridge damage, and the cost of repairs didn't equal the potential in income, and that piece was taken out. This map shows another map showing it, and you can see over here to the left-hand side, you can see this big gap. Um, Now, what was new in the 60s is if you see Grand Prairie over here, I'm running my cursor around it. From Grand Prairie down, this is something called, it was originally called the Alberta Resources. Uh, it was the Alberta Resources was built because they wanted to tap into the resources in Alberta, things timber, gas fields, coal. So the province of Alberta financed it, but this Canadian National built it, and the Canadian National operated it. So there was never a piece of equipment that said Alberta Resources. And I found a document that was put out before the line was ever built, and it was extolling the benefits that it would bring, and they're showing the kinds of traffic they might have. So up top here we see Grand Prairie, where they made the link into the Northern Alberta, and down below, if you follow it all the way down, you see where the Alberta Resources join into the main line of the CN. So in this particular day, we're going to ride the Alberta Resources, even though it looks just like Canadian. It's a Canadian National operated, and we're going to head into Jasper. So this was another photo run by, and you see Mr. Sterling Toy with his pipe, getting some fresh air, and the guy on the right is George Pins, making sure that whatever, it, it was a safe stop. And they took the trip. There's a major bridge there. I think well, you'll see it in a second. So building the Alberta Resources was not a matter of just throwing some track down and running a train. There were some major bridges. And this is going over what they call the Wapiti River, Wapiti. And obviously they've dropped the people off. They run the train across the trestle so people can get their shots. And here's the river. Nothing to be seen, just a wilderness. And there's the trestle looking back from the 120. Shortly thereafter, they made another stop along another river I think called the Smoky. I might have my rivers mixed up. I'm not sure. I guess the guy in the right there is George Pins. He's just making sure that everybody gets back on safely. A couple of rail fans discussing the trip, I suppose, on the rear platform. I don't think on the whole Alberta Resources, I can't think that we saw a dwelling of any kind, just wilderness. One more bridge, one more picture. As some Canadian national guys got on, I suppose there was a union agreement that you had to have Canadian National brakeman and a conductor and whatever. And these guys, but these are not passengers. They're Canadian National employees. And now we're back on the main line, heading into Jasper. You'll notice that on the Northern Alberta, we didn't see any signals. The whole line is dark. Everything was done by train order. We're in Jasper. And the Canadian National put a steam heater car on to keep us comfortable. We had a day layover in Jasper. This is the train that went to Prince Rupert. From going west from Jasper, you can either go, the main line will take you sort of to the southwest and down to Vancouver, and there's the line that sort of goes straight ahead to Prince Rupert. So we had this day layover in Jasper. I rented a car, and with two other people, we took a little trip through the Rockies. And we stopped at Lake Louise, and we looked out and saw the Canadian, I think, well, this was the Canadian on the CP line. Lots of people getting on and off this train. It's a big tourist spot. And we took a trip up to the spiral tunnels as well. I never got the shots I would have liked to have gotten. We was kind of rushed, but that was at least I can say I saw the spiral tunnels. There I am, 45 years ago, and you can see the map of the spiral tunnels. So I'm sure most people realize that the point of the spiral tunnels is to avoid unacceptable grades, on very, very heavy grades. Of course, or a big expense and operational expense. If you can reduce the grade, you've saved yourself a lot of money. And this is the threesome. I'd like to think that the guy on the left is still around. Back in Jasper. Great power in Jasper Yard. And if you over to the right, you see the 6508. That was with us on the Northern Alberta, and it will stay with us all the way to Vancouver. Okay, the prior year I had no idea I'd be riding the pin strip. The prior year I took a trip to Alaska, and I went across Canada that year. And when I got to Jasper, I took a shot at getting a cab ride, and this guy was especially friendly, and I got a cab ride west of Jasper. And this guy's name is Jack Daly, and there were two engineers midway through the trip. They switched places, and Jack Daly ran the train. So when I got to Jasper again a year later, I said, wow, maybe I get another cab ride. And I called Jack Daly up, and he said, oh, she said, it's too bad. He said, I'm taking a week's vacation. He said, you can try with the crew, just see what happens. But not everybody is as friendly as Jack Daly, of course. And the next day, to my great surprise, here's Jack Daly on the platform, and he was arranging a ride for me. So here's a cab view of looking back at the yard, the work train, a motley set of equipment. And from the cab, the work train is actually going out ahead of the via passenger train. Passing a freight. And the work train is now gone into the siding for us. Till you get used to it, the tunnels seem kind of small as you're coming up on them. There's not much clearance. This is where the line to Prince Rupert splits off. So the track below, if you were on the track below, you'd be going to Prince Rupert. If you look to the right there, you can see the train stretched out. It's like, I think it's an 18-car train, including the three special cars. And this is Mount Robson, the tallest mountain in Canada. Frequently cloud covered, so you can never. I've been there 2 or 3 times. I've never seen the peak. This guy's name is Jim LeClaire. Loads of freight. And at some point, the engineers switch, and this guy's name was Jim Stappert. I never heard of these guys again. This is the final leg into Vancouver. Okay, so on the trip, I was talking to Frimbo, and Frimbo asked me if I wanted to take a ride to on our free day in Vancouver. He says, "Do you want to take a ride on the British Columbia line?" And we did. The British Columbia Railroad ran an RDC trip that went all the way up. I think it was they call Fort William or Prince William or something like that, almost like a 300-mile trip. And midway, there was a stop at Lillooet. So the train that went all the way ran every other day. The train to Lillooet ran every day. And the engineer was very friendly here, and I was riding the cab here as well. And this engineer's name was Hugh Campbell, as friendly as can be. Some track work going on. And as you went along, you found these little flag stops, and most of them, there was nobody waiting. If there was, he would have stopped. And these places are so isolated that it doesn't even seem like there's a road into them. You see a lake on the right-hand side. The line follows two lakes up called Seton Lake and Anderson Lake. Another little flag stop. The water of one of the two lakes. I don't know which one. And here's a stop where somebody was waiting. That's quite a station, I must say. I don't know what the name of the station is, and I don't know what the 132 stands for. Maybe it's the mile marker. I'm not sure. But these two women got on the train. I guess they were going to go into Lillooet and do some shopping. I'm not sure. So Seton Portage is where the two lakes is the split in the two lakes. Going back in eons of time, the two lakes were one, but something happened, some major geological event happened, and they became two lakes, Seton Lake and Anderson Lake. As you can see, the scenery is unreal. The original line here was called the Pacific Great Eastern. The Pacific Great Eastern uh, way underestimated what the cost to construct this line would be, and they were basically barely surviving for years and years. And then I guess the province of British Columbia stepped in to get the thing going. So here we are in Lillooet, and that's Frimbo sitting there. When we got to Lillooet, we were both hungry, and me being a little sprier than Frimbo, I went off and got some lunch, and we sat here and had a nice lunch. Lots of good alcohol power. So in this shot, the equipment on the far left are the two RDC cars that we rode up in, and the other two RDCs are coming in, and they'll be hitched together, and we'll go back as a four-car RDC train. A lot of people getting on and off, and the train was pretty heavily used. And you see Frimbo is still sitting there observing the whole thing off to the right. Okay, we're on the way back now. And it's just as scenic going south as it was going north. Very informal there. This little girl seemed to know the engineer quite well, and she hung out in the cab for quite a while. And then later in that day, a man brought his daughter up. So one thing I'm interested in that may be a little offbeat was the bus system in Vancouver. They're still running, one of the few places that still does it. They still run a fleet of trolley buses. And here you can see the poles going up. And these are not just any trolley buses, these are Brill trolley buses, the Brill company that built thousands and thousands of trolleys. And it's hard to believe that these things haven't been replicated in other places. I mean, if you're talking about environmental effects, these things run on electricity, and they're more maneuverable than trolley cars. They can pull to the curb, they can work around traffic most of the time, and they're electric. Okay, it's time for the trip back. We're back at Vancouver Station, and this time there's no side trips. It's a 4-day trip straight back. And you can see they've given the 120 a good wash. It looks a lot cleaner here than it did some of the shots coming up. And then after a day or two on the road, it gets back to looking a little grimy again. Nice wave from the conductor there. Edmonton had a brand new light rail system, and for a short way, it paralleled the CN Main. And here's George Pins. And this is a man I didn't really talk to very much. He was a steward on the train, Mr. Harris. So George had a crew of three, and I think all these people have pretty much been recalled out of retirement. Passing a freight train. I think most of you know this is Winnipeg. The Canadian National is a very profitable railroad. At least it is these days. And there was some sort of switching moves at Winnipeg. I can't recall what they were all about. We're going east, the Canadian coming west. And now we're back in Ontario. I don't know where, but you can see the characters. We're not in the plains anymore. We've left the Rocky Mountains long behind. Some sort of work train, putting in concrete ties. And I think the structures on the flat cars, I think they're little dormitories for the workers. Capriole. And as luck would have it, we passed another private car going the other way. This is the Chapel Hill, I believe it is. And back in Toronto. Now we're in Montreal. Here's the Canadian going west as we're coming in. So we had a free day in Montreal. I took it upon myself to go see the Antique Electrics on the commuter service. And I took in a Montreal Expos game. If anybody's a baseball fan here, if you look to the right, you can see a few people that wound up on the Mets team later on. So this is 1979. Here's Gary Carter, who came to the Mets. And for the Reds, we see Ray Knight came to the Mets, and they both played a big part in that miracle year of 1986. The game wasn't very good. The Expos won 13-1. So, found a little postscript on this trip to do with Frimbo. I kept in contact with Frimbo. He was interesting and a very interesting guy. When he after the trip, he got quite ill, and he was in bed for quite a bit. And I was trying to get information for a trip to South America. I was interested in going to South America, which I finally did. Uh, and of course, he had traveled all over the world, and he had, there was no internet then. He was a very, very good source of information. So he tells me here, this letter went on and on about some other stuff, but he finishes by saying the time in bed was spent bringing my mileage up to date, 2,539,870. And I'm not too sure. Here we go. And when he passed away 2 years later, his brother put up a plaque someplace in Colorado, and giving the final count of something like 2.7 million miles. Anyway, that was his obsession, and then he satisfied that obsession. Whoops, what's going on here? Okay, no, I'm not too sure what's happening all of a sudden. Hmm. Hmm. Very strange. Okay, let's just. Don't get it.
I think you might be zoomed in.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dan. That was a awesome
Yeah.
presentation.
Anyway, thank you for inviting me again. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
it was a good. I enjoyed revisiting the trip.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. It was great to have you back and presenting a show for us. A lot of great comments in the webinar chat, compliments, and seems like some people are planning their own
I think
Canadian
there were some people from
Rockies trips.
Alberta watching this presentation.
I
Uh,
wouldn't doubt it. We
yeah,
get people from all over.
yeah, and
One
George Prince, I'm sure, is watching as well.
very nice. Yeah, one meeting we had someone from Switzerland on board on the call. We had someone from Australia, so it's quite crazy what you can do on Zoom here.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see here. There's a question that says, "What's Mr. Pins doing now?" I
There we go.
can't speak for Mr. Pins, but I know the 120 is now owned by Bennett Levin. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, Dan. I really appreciate it. Recorded the meeting, so it'll be up on our website in the next few days. All right. With that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate you coming out. We had about 100 people tune in for the presentation, which is great. Our next presentation will be on March 13th. That'll be my presentation on the Delaware and Northern. And then on April 10th will be Steve Barry in person at the Reynos Auditorium at St. Elizabeth University. So we hope to see people come out for that. Thank you again, Dan. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everyone next time.
Good night, all.
Good night, Dan. Thank you.